It is spring 551 AD, and at Serdica, the ancient Thracian capital that was birthplace to the emperors Aurelian and Galerius, and now serves as the seat of the diocese of Dacia, an army that has been expressly formed with the intention of matching its ancient forebears in size and ambition, is awaiting orders to march. Its leader is Germanus, cousin of the Emperor Justinian and his likely heir. Such was Germanus's reputation when he planted his standard at Serdica, that from his small original complement of Roman soldiers, men from across the empire and indeed the barbarian tribes have rushed to join in his expedition. His objective is Italy, his ancestral homeland, and the mother of all cities that is now sadly reduced to a decayed husk after countless sieges and untold violence. With Germanus at the Roman army's head, however, Italy will come once more under the auspices of the Caesars, and Germanus will rule from the west as the junior emperors did in the time of antiquity. In Constantinople itself and the great cities of the Roman East, the plague that has assailed its citizens from all rungs of society for almost a decade is at last in abatement, and there is a renewed sense of vitality and purity in the crisp air over the lofty arches, vaults and columns that reach for the very heavens themselves. Further to that, Justinian has been able to commit resources once more to the reclamation of the lost western provinces, following the winding down of the war with the Sasanians, a de facto truce in the southern border regions, meaning that fighting on that front is now confined to the small area of Lazica on the Black Sea coast. Better still, word filters from Italy that former Byzantine garrisons and allies stand ready to commit themselves to Germanus's cause, and he makes it known that he will distribute all back pay on arrival, as he did in his campaigns in Africa. All is set for Rome and the Romans to fulfill their holy destiny, and final preparations are in place for the dramatic departure when Germanus falls ill and dies just 2 days before his scheduled commencement of campaign. Suddenly, from the height of confidence, all is thrown yet again into confusion and disarray. The empire is again on a precipice. At the time of Germanus's death, the Byzantine hold on Italy, once almost entirely complete after the initial campaigns of Belisarius, is now a precarious and fragile thing. Once Belisarius was withdrawn east after his second Italian campaign, sometime between 448 and 449, the Ostrogothic king Totila swooped in and retook Rome, the city he once vowed to destroy, just as Carthage was laid waste by the legions. And then he began using captured Roman ships to attack Roman-held Sicily and carry out raids on the Dalmatian coast. At the same time, the Franks took the opportunity to seize control of almost all of northern Italy. While Totila uses the stick of naval raids and an audacious Ostrogoth invasion of Sicily, he also offers a proverbial carrot in the form of overtures to Justinian, asking permission to rule Italy in the emperor's name, just as Theodoric the Great did in the early decades of the century. Justinian is unmoved by such appeals, and Totila's attempts to present himself as a leader in the mold of the Caesars come to naught. The Ostrogoth has even the temerity to host games at the decayed shell of the Hippodrome, presiding over the races from the venerable imperial box like an ape that's been dressed in a toga, or so Justinian sees it. But Justinian, aging now himself, signals the determination of his antecedents when he sends a fleet to destroy Totila's ships off Ancona, late in 550, and then proceeds with the recapture of Sicily by the general Artabanus. But the death of Germanus is a body blow. Putting aside his grief and the loss of his legacy, Justinian must find a replacement for the prematurely departed prince. Belisarius, the original Roman reconqueror of the West, is still active. However, he has already spent years in Italy and had his conquests in Justinian's name reversed twice, so he is reluctant to spend yet more of his dwindling time retreading old ground in the hope of striking it lucky on the third attempt. Instead, Germanus's command is passed to Narses, the eunuch who had the valor and daring to walk into Constantinople's hippodrome 2 decades earlier and negotiate the defection of the previously rebellious Blues to Justinian's cause, and so end the near-revolutionary Nika riots. Now past 70 and certainly no threat to the emperor's throne, Narses is an unlikely military general, but he accepts the most sacred and hallowed command and sets out north towards Serdica. Although Justinian had not given Germanus a great host of men, he had provided him with an ample war chest. Now he provides Narses with both. The delay following Germanus's death has seen further success on the eastern front, and the general Bessus claims Lassician Petra between the Caucasus and Black Sea coast. So assured is Justinian following this success that he orders contingents from the Thracian and Illyrian field armies to combine with Germanus's existing host, as well as sending elite men from the Praesental Central Army. To add to this, 4,000 Herulian federati serve Narses under their generals Philemut and Arut. 6,000 Lombards are contributed by their king Audoin, and there is even a complementary force of Persian cavalry, seemingly sent as a gesture of goodwill, from the Sasanian Shahanshah Khosrow I. Narses takes command in April 551, and by the start of the next year's campaigning season, he and his army of 25,000 eager and confident fighters begin their march to reclaim the birthplace of their civilization. Upon reaching the northernmost edges of the Italian peninsula, Narses draws intelligence from scouts and spies who make it clear that Totila is well aware of his approach, and the Ostrogoth has sent his own general Teia to block the main passes, highways. Teia's mission is to create ambushes and ready mobile units to harass and wither the advancing Roman machine as it winds its way toward the inevitable showdown with the barbarian king. Simultaneously, the Franks, who are still allied with Totila, indicate they will remain aloof from the fighting, but they will not give Narses permission to move through their territory. Fighting the two tribes at one time is inadvisable, so Narses draws upon the centuries-long legacy of Roman ingenuity that has been passed down to him from the time of the ancient Republic. He marches his army south along the coastal strip of the eastern Italian seaboard, shadowed by the now commanding Roman fleet. The victory at Ancona has brought with it vital control of the sea, and Narses has also heard that Totila's finest warriors were among those who were rammed and bludgeoned to the bottom of the Mediterranean in the battle. Morale amongst the Ostrogoths has similarly plunged as a result. The shoreward march allows Narses to both bypass Teia's traps as well as avoid the Franks. To the stupefaction of the observing Ostrogoth scouts, when his army come to the mouth of a river, the support vessels of the navy row into the estuaries and form improvised pontoon bridges, letting his men cross the water by moving from deck to deck. In this way, Teia waits for an army that never appears. and Totila grows increasingly irate at the seemingly inexplicable continued approach of the man he calls an ancient, gelded Greek. On June 6th, Narses enters Ravenna, and it becomes clear to Totila that battle with his entire force is an inevitability. While Narses marches on after a short rest in the East Roman Italian capital, the Ostrogoth army moves up the ancient Via Flaminia and arrives at Taginae. Narses meanwhile continues his coastal march, fighting a sharp engagement at Rimini with an Ostrogoth garrison that has destroyed the bridge in an attempt to forestall his advance, before turning abruptly west and making for Busta Gallorum. He establishes his camp there, while Totila also consolidates his confederation of troops and sends out further summonses for reinforcements. Narses understands that Totila is in something of a quandary, and that the onus is on him to act, and not the Romans. Even though the Roman leader sends messengers to the Ostrogoth with the offer of peaceful surrender and captivity, there is to be no settlement this time. Totila cannot continue to operate freely, and the Roman expedition is too expensive to allow for anything but a decisive result. Totila can theoretically withdraw, but his only haven would be the shattered remnant of Rome, where yet another siege would end in its inevitable capture and a further destruction of its hallowed environs. Totila's only hope is to destroy the Roman army in the field, and that way continue to rule the wasteland that he calls his empire. He sends word to Narses that he will fight him in 8 days' time, but the eunuch general does not allow his men to drop their guard. Knowing that the Ostrogoth will come to him, Narses chooses his ground, again drawing on the military wisdom passed down from Caesar through Frontinus and Vegetius. The site he picks is an Apennine river valley through which passes the Bono stream, where his center will be positioned on an extended rise of high ground, and a hill protects his left wing. The ground to the rear of this position is rocky and jagged, quite impassable for an army moving at speed, hoping to launch a surprise attack. Scouting the field, Narses finds a pathway around the hill on the left flank, which he fortifies with a sentry detachment and renders impassable. In his center, he deploys the Lombards, Heruli and Gepid federates, likely numbering 10,000 men, a massive and intimidating force for the time. He orders these to dismount and form a phalanx that is expected to stand firm in the face of the heavy Ostrogoth cavalry charge. On the wings, Narses' general Valerian takes the right and commands a force of cavalry, arranged in a crescent formation, their armaments mixed between mounted archers and lancemen, and in front of them stand almost 4,000 foot archers. Narses commands an identical complement on the left. Totila's first move is to have a cavalry party attempt to storm and capture the Roman left hill by way of the side track, but 50 of Narses' guards form a shield wall and hold fast in the face of their repeated attacks. Their determination, coupled with the disadvantageous terrain, leads to the abandonment of the assault. The Gothic cavalry withdraws in the face of the spearmen. First blood goes to the Romans. When Totila and his own host draws in sight of the Roman line, they are arrayed in the same manner as Narses has chosen, with an infantry complement in the center and cavalry on the wings. It is an awesome spectacle. Even though the Romans outnumber the Goths, this is Totila, the man who captured Rome and promised to turn it into pasture land. He is the new Hannibal, the new Attila, a phantom ghoul come to life before their eyes. While the Roman army watches from the hill, this demonic apparition spurs his horse and rides into the open valley below their position, his wild and horrific eyes staring up at them unceasingly with a haunted gaze. Hardened veterans shudder. Younger recruits bless themselves to ward off what are surely the depraved, nightmarish spells he is casting on them. He rides forth and sits on horseback before them. Narses and his high command can only wonder what kind of nefarious and diabolical act he will commit, while they can only watch and wait. Totila's horse put its left hoof out. The Romans catch their breath, waiting. His horse draws its hoof in, and then puts the right hoof out. The Roman front line crease their eyes in concentration, disbelieving their own senses. They cannot believe what they are seeing. Totila's horse has begun to dance. Stupefied, the hardened cataphracts and Germanic federates look at one another in wonder and incredulity. Totila embarks a series of elaborate jumps and pirouettes, his horse nimbly following his commands to canter, saute, and plie, raising a discreet cloud of dust, while the Roman and Goth armies begin to murmur alike in admiration, before breaking into a round of applause when the warlord climaxes a quick chassé into a pas de bourrée. Soaking up the adulation like an old hand of the stage, Totila invites the Romans to send forth their champions to engage his Goths in single combat. Narses, through it all, remains unmoved. In truth, Totila's performance has been an attempt to play for time and await the arrival of 2,000 reinforcements that he knows to be on the way. When he is given word that they have arrived, he returns to his lines and ostentatiously withdraws his men out of their formations and off the field. Once they are away from the Roman position, he announces that they will take their lunch, and the Goths sit down to eat in the now hot summer sun. Again, Totila is playing games with his opponent, hoping that Narses will see the Gothic disengagement as a retreat and leave his position of advantage to chase after them in the valley. But it is not to be. Narses holds firm and waits, the patience of age steadying his men in the center and wings as they eat their own ration in one hand while holding spear and bow in the other. Totila reappears and draws up his formations and companies once more, this time with the cavalry forming a long line in front of the less numerous infantry. And suddenly, as the sun finally begins to recede in the sky, there is no more time for delay, no more sideshows, no more flamboyant displays of feasting or confidence. The eunuch Greek will not move. His men stare impassively and unfazed at the Goths. Totila has run out of road. The reckoning stands before him. On a ridge close by where they believe Roman armies fought invading Gauls during the earliest days of the Republic. No man can escape his fate, and so it is with Totila there in that scorching cauldron. The Goth raises his arm high, and a war cry erupts from the thousands of men all around him. They spur their horses forward, and the ground shakes with the thunderous impact, and the dust rises like incense at a funeral mass. They screech and holler, following Totila's order to use lance only and break the Roman lines, which he is sure are made up of reluctant mercenaries, and will flinch before facing the might of his Goths. For a full minute or more, the warriors bask in the glory and power of the charge, touching the almost divine elation of weightlessness and might. Narses and his generals watch them approach. Then he too makes a signal with his hand, which is passed on to the subordinates in the center and the right wing. Some of the Goths notice the change on the flanks, the movement of the bows being brought out, the notching of the arrows. The majority are lost in the moment, their eyes straight ahead. When they thunder past the range markers put in place by Roman junior officers earlier that morning, the order is given to raise bows and fire. 8,000 lethally sharp bolts cut into the densely packed mass of human and horse flesh, and the front and second lines of the Gothic cavalry are shredded into ribbons. But on they come, their bravery and valor scorning the mortal danger in which they find themselves, and then the second volley comes, and the charge is hobbled. Those that do make it to the Roman line in the centre are sparse and injured, Narses' infantry throwing their own missiles to compound the misery, and the Gothic attempts to lunge and poke at the shield wall are half-hearted. They withdraw to try and regroup, but this only puts them in range for another lethal volley from the archers on the flank, and then another as they start to prevaricate and cower. The Romans have so far fired 32,000 arrows at the enemy in just 4 salvos, and their supplies are ample for many, many more. Despite Totila and his loyal commander's attempts to rally the men, the Goths want no more of the engagement, and they begin to depart and break for safety. Narses has waited his moment well, and now that his foe is reeling, he gives the order for his own cavalry to ride forth. This leads to complete alarm among the Goth companies, and their horsemen start to sprint away from the oncoming warriors. Any hope of mounting a stand disappears when the infantry panic in turn and begin fleeing from the field when they see their elite in a stampede of distress. The Romans begin a general pursuit, and the result is a carnage of slaughter as they cut down their hopeless enemies. Totila himself is brought down by a Gepid, his retainers upbraiding the man for serving the Romans and not his natural rulers, the Goths. In the wake of the disaster, Teia takes control of the remnant of the Ostrogothic army, but all are aware that the matter is now a foregone conclusion. Rome will once again be ruled by the emperors, but a destroyed and broken city, its population a mere fragment of its once awesome cohort, taken by a majority barbarian army led by a Greek eunuch. It is not a place that Augustus, Vespasian, Trajan, or Marcus would recognize. The world has changed, but for now, thanks to the actions of the most unlikely military hero, Narses, some kind of order becomes at least imaginable once more. It is July 552 AD, and in the wilds of Etruria, Italy, a small party of horsemen is riding through the night with a hunting party at their backs. These hunters howl like wolves as they cut down the escapees' comrades in the fields and ditches behind, the screams punctuating the sultry night, along with the drum of hooves and the caught breath of terrified men clutching tight at their reins. At the party's head, a tall man leans forward in the saddle, his right arm held up and immobile as though he is winded. It is only when a cloud passes and they ride under the unfiltered moonlight that the blood leaking down his horse's flank glistens in an unending stream. The wounded man is Totila, king of the Ostrogoths and twice conqueror of Rome. His paltry number of remaining guards pray that they will reach safety with him by morning, so that they can dress his wounds and bring the legendary talisman back from the dead. But it is not to be. By the time that the party reaches the village of Capraia, a mere 7 miles from the battlefield at Taginae, on which disaster had befallen them a day earlier, Totila is dead. Not wishing to tarry so close to the vicinity where their enemies are embarking on a spree of murderous vengeance, Totila's attendants bury his body with unseemly haste, and then flee, pressing on to a place where Roman swords will not reach them. In the meantime, the forces of the Roman general Narses, the elderly court eunuch who has now bested the most virile and savage of warriors, are unaware of their nemesis's fate. It is only when an old Gothic woman shows them the shallow gravesite and they exhume the carcass from the dirt that they are convinced the nightmare of Totila's deprivations are over. And yet, there is still work needed before the commencement of reconstruction. Already, the remnants of Totila's Ostrogoths are coalescing around his general Teias, and Teias knows exactly what needs to be done if he is to have any hope of avoiding Totila's terrible fate. He brings his few thousand warriors to Ticinum over the Po River, where Totila stored a great cache of treasure. Suddenly, Narses' position is not nearly so strong as it might have appeared in the immediate aftermath of the triumph at Taginae. At a time when the greatest Roman field army in Italy numbers a little over 20,000 men, Teias' force of a few thousand is still a power to be reckoned with. And what is more, the Franks, who are no friends of the Romans, still occupy the north of the peninsula. Teias bets that he can use Totila's treasure to bring the Franks into alliance with him, thereby creating a new host with which to seize the great prize that is Italy. Narses, meanwhile, has his own objective. Leaving aside Teias and the threat of the Franks for the moment, he makes directly for the crown jewel that ranks above all others in the civilized world, the city of Rome itself. First, however, he must dispense with unnecessary burdens. The Lombards, the Germanic people who have made a name for themselves in their spoliation and rapine, are paid off and thanked for their service. Narses instructs his general Valerian to see the tribe back to the northern border and out of Italy, which he does, and then makes to absorb the city of Verona back into the Roman fold. Valerian is quickly warned off this action by the Franks, who claim that Verona falls within their sphere of influence, and he accordingly withdraws south once more. There was once a time where a Roman senator needed only to draw a line in the sand, even thousands of miles from the city, and entire empires would come to a halt. Now, Valerian's capitulation in this autumn of 552 is another reminder that that time of unsurpassed Roman power is long past. Instead, he takes up position on the Po at Narses' command, watching the far bank in the event that Teias makes his alliance and the Franks combine their forces with his own. Narses himself, meanwhile, moves from the battlefield of Taginae and into Tuscany, and there he takes Narni and Spoleto, as well as the traitorous garrison of Perusia. Narses then arrives before the skeletal remains of Rome and surveys the vista with melancholy. On the worn stone of the remaining walls, the Gothic garrison stares sullenly back at him. Behind them, the once majestic and awe-inspiring buildings are blackened and charred by fire, and the ceilings pulled and collapsed, leaving the great porticos and terraces exposed to the elements. At night, when lightning flashes across the approaching winter sky and cold rain falls, it is as though Narses and his men have entered the realms of a deathly middle place between Earth and the underworld. But in the daytime, superstitions and lamentations must be put to the side, and Narses assesses the task in front of him. With the Aurelian walls too wide to defend in their reduced numbers, the Goths holding the city have withdrawn to the mausoleum of Hadrian, and built a shorter wall around it to link with the main city wall, and there constructed a fortified redoubt, likely incorporating the Tiber either as a barrier and/or water supply. Even still, Narses knows that the far greater part of the Ostrogothic strength lies dead at the bottom of the waters off Sicily, following the Roman naval victory off Ancona, as well as on the field at Taginae. He thus splits his forces outside the walls and begins what appears to the defenders to be a series of random attacks. First, the same archers who tore apart the cavalry of Totila just weeks earlier march up and loose volleys upon the walls, and then at another spot further down, John, the nephew of McCallion, makes an attack with another force. Still more of the Roman barbarian foederati storm a third point. While the Goths rush to defend from all three of these simultaneous offensives, Narses observes their actions for a time, and, satisfied that they have shown their hand, he orders a fourth force, this time under the general Dagisteus, to advance on the walls at an isolated point and attempt a breach. Dagisteus finds little to no resistance, and his men climb their ladders and enter the ancient and sacred precincts of the Holy City. Narses watches as the gates swing open and Rome is once more in the hands of the Caesars, the fifth time it has changed hands since the advent of Justinian's reign. In response, Teia has several hundred Roman children, taken hostage from noble families by Totila prior to the Battle of Taginae, put to death, as well as any Roman senator that he can locate within reach of his now murderous gangs. Narses is still not finished his task of mopping up the Ostrogothic remnants. He sends a force south to the city of Cumae, where it is said that Totila has lodged another great store of treasure and puts it to siege. Still unable to lure the Franks into an alliance, Teia begins a march south to halt the city's capture. The loss of this treasury would condemn the Ostrogoths to little more than bandit status. Narses sends his general John to guard the western roads in Etruria and block any potential advance by Teia, while Valerian holds the Via Flaminia after capturing Petra Pertusa. Narses expects the Ostrogoth leader to take the most direct route to Cumae in order to relieve his comrades, but Teia knows that the Romans are expecting him. Betting that the Goths in Cumae can hold out, he takes a leaf out of Narses' book and veers to the Adriatic coast roads, moving down and around the Roman holding forces. His plan is audacious. Having stayed in touch with the remaining ships of the Gothic fleet, he crosses the peninsula by way of Beneventum and orders the ships to await him at Neapolis. Rather than fight his way through the Roman army and the Cumae siege, he will have the fleet bring him and his force into the city, where they will secure the treasure and either fight it out with Narses, or else withdraw once more by sea to safety. But as his army winds its way along the Campanian trails in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, the looming volcano spitting fire and black smoke up to the heavens, they come into sight of the Drakon River, and there awaits them a formidable sight. Informed of the Ostrogoths' plans, Narses has moved swiftly and occupied the far bank of the river, blocking Teia' route to link up with his ships. But the peculiar nature of the waterway also delays any possibility the two armies might have of provoking an engagement with the other. Although the Drakon is quite narrow, its banks are particularly steep, and a fording under fire and assault is quite impossible. Teia' forces seize the bridge over the river, and they are able to supply their ranks from the Gothic fleet. But apart from providing these provisions, the ships are of no other assistance. Teias has no place to embark his thousands of men, while Narses can theoretically launch an attack as the Ostrogoth host is in redeployment. Stalemate is the result. Both sides dispatch archers to the banks with limited results, each army driving the other back out of range or under cover, but they are unable to make the breakthrough over to the other's lines. This state of action continues for some weeks, stretching eventually into 2 months, with both commanders intent on holding their position and giving no quarter to the enemy. Teias has the idea to use the shielding provided by his archers to construct siege towers on the bridge, thus giving him an extra edge in regard to range. But the response from Narses is to redouble his own efforts and then build his own siege towers in response. With these fastening the Ostrogoths in place, the situation on land settles once more, but worse is to come for Teias. The Roman fleet arrives off the coast and hovers over the relatively fragile Ostrogothic flotilla. From the sea, the Gothic admiral looks at his available options and decides on the most pragmatic option. He surrenders to the Empire, and with that action, Teias and the Ostrogoths in the field are stripped of supplies. Desperation born of the long, fruitless fighting on the side of the volcanic river sets in, and Teias attempts to lead a withdrawal. This takes them up a slope that Procopius tells us is called the Milk Mountain, or Mons Lactarius in Latin, but the choice of following its inhospitable and hostile ground to deter the Romans from pursuit only results in the Ostrogoths being further isolated from resupply. Teias has made a fateful error, and the situation is stark: death by starvation or battle. The Roman army is tracking and stalking the Goths, and they arrive at the foot of the mountain, searching for trails and passageways, sealing the heights from any possible escape. Before they can settle into an organized siege position, however, the Gothic army lurches forward like a cornered scorpion, and its thousands of warriors scream down the hill, spear and sword in hand. Electing to do battle without horses, Teias' men have decided that it is better to fight for their life rather than watch it ebb away. And their attack is mad, desperate, frenzied. The Romans, who are still marking out their camp and formations, are taken by surprise when the tumult of Goths floods over their pickets and forward lines and rushes directly into their midst. But the Romans and their own barbarian allies stand their ground, scorning the notion that they will be bested by a rabble of inferior numbers. They rush forward with their own sharpened lances and stones, arrows flying overhead from both sides where men carry bows. The pitch of battle is deliriously vicious, quarter neither asked nor given. Here a man has his stomach opened by the slash of a blade. There another falls to the ground by a thrown javelin. Position and deployment are impossible. The churned up and lunar nature of the mountainside makes it so. They fight as pressed masses, packs of animals ripping and tearing each other asunder until one is inevitably destroyed. Teias knows that he must lead from the front to inspire his men, and this he does, but he is quickly identified by the Romans. Narses' men target him, making the Goths fight all the harder for their leader. His shield fills with thrown spears as he swaps it for another with his guard. Teias fights on, killing Romans left and right, but his second shield fills with yet more thrown lances, and he swaps it once more. Eventually, however, his moment of vulnerability comes, and one of the Romans times his throw just at the second that Teia exchanges yet another of the shields and leaves his chest unguarded. The brave leader is struck and dies almost immediately. Yet the Goths fight on, for they know that the end of their people is close at hand. With only a third of the day past, they careen and lunge at the Roman lines, and Narses' forces respond with their own counterattacks and the display of Teia's head on a Roman javelin. Eventually, as night nears and a likely final massacre becomes an ever closer possibility, the remaining Ostrogoths sue for peace. Their surrender rests on the promise to not only withdraw from the field and relinquish all claim to Italy and imperial lands, but to leave the peninsula and never return to it again. Thus, the Confederation of the Ostrogoths, which had formed in the wake of Attila's defeat a century before and come to rule Rome itself for decades, is brought to an end, sputtering from the pages of history in a hard-fought and bloody last stand, the pride of its warriors intact, while the glory of Rome is made manifest. For Narses, there is negotiation to facilitate the delayed capture of Cumae, and then the greater work of rebuilding Italy and Rome itself. It is past the time that any real restoration of Rome's grandeur is possible. The city has long been in decline, but 18 years of war with the Goths has rendered it little more than a provincial outpost, in the same state that Carthage long served in the centuries following its own fall. So it will be with Rome, and thus ever to the fortunes of the great and glorious. There is no respite for the army of the Emperor Justinian, however. For almost the same moment that Teia's head is tossed aside and thrown to the dogs, disquieting news arrives from the realms of the Franks to the north. War will rage on, after all. It is early winter 552, and throughout Italy there is a growing sense of relief and thanks for deliverance. The army of Narses, court eunuch to the Roman Emperor Justinian, has now delivered no fewer than 2 great victories in open battle with the Goths, first destroying the main army of Totila at Taginae, and then obliterating the remnants under Teia in the shadow of Vesuvius. A few of the small remaining Gothic garrisons dotted around the country hunker down and pray for a miracle, while thousands of others who have made their life in Italy over the preceding 60 years stream north. But just as the clouds of war appear to be finally blowing off and leaving nothing but clear skies, a new storm appears on the horizon. Theodebald of the Franks, barely 20 years old and known to be sickly, has thus far stood aloof from taking a side in the war between the Romans and the Goths. The Franks control the north of Italy, and there has been little need to waste good men in the interminable 16-year Gothic War. Now, the moment has come to strike. 2 leaders of ancient Alemanni peoples, Lutherus and McCallion, step forward and seek permission to lead a force south. The Alemanni are ostensibly subject to the Franks since the victories of Clovis decades earlier, but Theodebald puts no restriction on his vassals recruiting Frankish warriors for what is to be an invasion of the still rich Italian peninsula. Thus, with Narses negotiating at the walls of Cumae in the spring following the bitter battle with Teia at Mons Lactarius, 75,000 barbarians flood across the border and make straight for the shell-shocked cities of Italy. Narses acts decisively in the face of the invasion, leaving a holding force at Cumae and then moving into the central terrain of the peninsula. Centumcelle, Florence, Volaterrae, Pisa and Luna all come over to the imperial side in short order, but there remains a defiant Gothic garrison at Lucca, and they have heard that the Franks are sending an army to fight the Romans. They will not surrender. The mixed Alemanni and Frank army is by now approaching Parma, and Narses sends another mixed host and the greater part of his front-line fighters north under John and Valerian to take up position on the Po and block any advance. Nevertheless, the Alemanni take Parma. A force of Heruli attempt to retake the town without awaiting Narses' orders or possible reinforcement, and they are badly defeated. John and Valerian retreat to Faventia, while the Alemanni and Franks put the north of Italy to fire and sword. Narses, meanwhile, has finally compelled the Lucans to surrender, and better news is to come when he moves on to Ravenna to arrange his strategy for the coming cold months. There, Aligen, the Gothic commander of Cumae, arrives and formally cedes control of the city to the Empire. With the situation in central and southern Italy stabilized, Tarentum having been won back at the same time as the campaign against Teia by the Roman commander of Hedrentum, Pacorius, Narses travels from Ravenna to Rome and governs there during the cold months. The crisis in the north will have to wait until spring. When the thaw does come, Narses surprises many by bringing the army that he had left in the environs of Ravenna south to Rome and draws his forces together there. It appears that sparing the mother of cities from another sacking is his main priority. Still, apart from the heavily walled town and fortresses, all of Etruria and the Adriatic regions are now fair game for the spoliating Alemanni and Franks. The pleasant weather brings with it the bouquet of death and holocaust, as the bands of Bucellin and Lutherus blaze ever mercilessly south. They demur at the prospect of laying siege to Rome, splitting into two separate bands under their respective leaders in Samnium and lighting trails of fire down the land. Berry tells us that Bucellin strikes with the greater number into Campania, Lucania and Bruti to the Straits of Messina. Lutherus helps himself to Apulia and Calabria as far as Hedruntum. This pillage pleases the Alemannic leader, and satisfied with his haul, he begins the march north once more. Bucellin, on the other hand, has been swayed not only by the numbers of Gothic remnants who have flocked to his standard and merrily joined his rampage, but also their and his own subordinates' encouragement to face Narses in battle and take the crown of Italy for himself. Seeing the passivity of the Roman commander during his march south, Bucellin decides that his time has indeed come, and he will offer battle to the elderly courtier. Sending word to Lutherus for reinforcement, he begins to march toward Capua. Lutherus is still marching north, but he promises to send the requested units once he is safely out of Italy. Raiding and the gigantic bounty of treasure and captives are enough for him. Lutherus's plans are dealt a blow, however, when his column is ambushed at Fanum by a force of Romans who have moved from their station at Pisaurum. The Alemanni and Franks are like a slow-moving turtle, so laid down are they with loot, and the Romans chase them off with glee and retake possession of the goods. Lutherus manages to clear the ambush with the better part of his force intact, which is a deliverance from what is a near-fatal brush with Narses' forces, but it remains a galling loss of the rosy future he had imagined for himself. He makes for the settlement of Citations to regroup and take stock of his position. Meanwhile, Narses has heard of Bucellen's move toward Capua and how he has established his position on the Volturnus river. Seeing this as the opportunity for which he had been waiting, Narses deploys his entire field force, 18,000 men, and marches to confront the Alaman and his horde. Any hope that Bucellen has of receiving extra companies from Lutherus evaporates when messengers arrive with news that disease has broken out at Citations, and the Alemannic force, as well as their Frankish and Goth allies, have died along with their commander. Bucellen will fight Narses alone. When Narses reaches Bucellen's position, he finds that the Alemannic's leader has built his camp so that the Volturnus acts as a bulwark on one side, and the remaining three are also well secured with defensive works, mostly the repurposed components of supply wagons and any other heavy objects to hand. Narses observes that Bucellen has fortified the nearest bridge with nothing less than a watchtower, thus not only giving cover against an attack on the camp's entrance, but providing a route of escape should the Romans successfully best the enemy in the field. Narses disdains to embark on a full-scale attack, which would likely be successful but undoubtedly costly in lives, so he proposes to offer open battle in the field. First, however, he must eliminate the tactical advantages of Bucellen's preparations. The Armenian cavalry officer Chanaranges is directed to lead what amounts to a commando mission. Capturing a number of Alemanni supply wagons, Chanaranges storms the bridge, taking the defenders by surprise, and then wheeling the wagon up to the tower with its contents set on fire. Choosing to vacate their wooden tower rather than burn to death, the defenders flee, and the first tactical win is to the Romans. Narses begins preparations for a decisive encounter, but he is interrupted when a disruption and altercation takes place in his camp. A member of the Heruls, the Foederati whose exemplary quality of infantry has assisted in the victories at Taginae and Mons Lactarius, puts a servant to death for an undisclosed infraction, and Narses calls the man up for punishment. The Herulian leadership protest, stating that they are free to follow their own traditions outside of Narses' Christian structures, but the Roman commander is adamant in reserving the right to give or take life within his own army. It is a strong test of Narses' leadership, and he cannot allow the Herulians to overrule him, or else he will lose control of his highly diverse force. In the end, outright violence among the Roman Confederation is avoided, but the Heruls announce that they will withdraw from the fighting. Narses respects their decision and makes it clear that he will keep the Herulian place in the line open should they have second thoughts and wish to partake in the coming battle. Seemingly unbeknownst to Narses, two disgruntled Herulians make their way into the Alemannic camp, and there they pass on word of events to Bucellen. They tell him in no uncertain terms that the Herulian section of the Roman line will be empty, and all he needs to do is direct his attack toward that, and the Roman line will implode like an inflated bladder. Bucellen is overjoyed at the intelligence, and the next morning when Narses draws up his formations to offer battle, he has his own companies brought forth from their fortifications, and they take their place on the field. The Romans take up a similar line to that they had formed at Taginae, an infantry centre with cavalry on the wings. While Narses had the majority of these horse archers on foot at the earlier battle, now he appears to order them to stay on their mounts. The missing Herulian position is glaring, but Narses has some troops kept in the rear in reserve in front of the Roman camp for any necessary developments. McCallion has been told that Narses' numbers are greatly reduced from their high point in the campaign against Totila, and it appears to the Alemannic leader that the Roman host is barely half that of his own 20,000 strong force, neatly fitting to the wooded areas on the left side of the Roman line. As at Taginae, Narses, in spite of his advanced years, has positioned himself on the right wing. The Alamans and their Frankish allies form into two distinct columns that converge into a strong single point at their head, the cuneus wedge or boar's head, so designed that the men at the front line can batter their way through the enemy using their tight shield wall. Though the Alamans and Franks are considered barbarians, their peoples have been in contact with the Romans for centuries, and they have a knowledge of military strategy and tactics, if not the discipline, supply, and training of the ancient legions. Narses' Roman army itself is also a degenerated entity from those centuries of greatness, and McCallion is of the opinion that this day will bring him glory and renown beyond imagination. The Herulian deserters have told him that not only is Narses missing their vital contingent, but the whole Roman army is despondent as a result of their withdrawal. McCallion need only smash his axe through their flimsy door, and the whole house will be his for the taking. At the trumpet's call, the Franks and Alamans storm forward toward the Roman position. Their spirits are high, their limbs strong. The lances and blades they carry are perfectly weighted and sharp. Even the hail of arrows from the archers lining the Roman center and the flanks fails to dampen their ardor. On they go, McCallion screaming out holy terror in their midst, urging them forward and feeling their strength grow with every step. By comparison, the Romans are silent, muted as they loose their bows and then throw their lances when the enemy is close and sprinting toward their redoubt. McCallion's men reach the Romans' palisade, axes chopping at the barricades, spears thrusting over at the faces of the defenders. They make straight for the gap where the Herulians should be making their stand, and they flood through the attempts to hold them back with dismissive ease. The boar's head has rammed its way to success, thousands of troops still behind in the two columns and making their way forward. The wider flanks and even units of the Roman center seemingly unable to get to grips with them. The same is true for the Roman reserve, which is engaged by some units of the advance guard, but others are able to bypass it entirely. The farthest units of McCallion's vanguard reach the outskirts of the Roman camp, and fighting erupts there with the sentries. The Germanic fury is incessant, inexhaustible. Spears stab at the defenders, and swords flash in arcs to bring down those who are distracted with defending themselves. McCallion can feel it. He has done what the great Totila failed to do and defeated the Roman eunuch. He can taste the ambrosia of victory on his tongue. His men are singing as they slaughter. Then, there is a change in the air. It seems as though the gods have flicked their fingers, and suddenly all is different in some indescribable manner. McCallion cannot see the units around the camp and fighting the Roman reserve, but it is clear that the forward movement has come to an abrupt cessation. The columns are not advancing any longer through the Roman line. Though it is past the line of visibility to the majority of Franks and Alamans in the midst of the battle, the Herulian infantry has emerged and formed a solid row of steel before McCallion's vanguard. With a cold fury every bit as effective as the enemy, they begin to push back the Franks. McCallion has time to finally register this, but there is nothing he can do, for at that same moment, Narses gives a signal from his position on the wing, and the Roman flanks begin to move outward. The wings are filled with horse archers, and these rain arrows down on the backs of the Franks and Aleman advanced front lines. The unfortunate vanguard is now being attacked on 3 sides at once, and its men quickly fall into despair when they cannot see the source of the arrows that are felling their comrades by the hundred. It is at this point that Narses gives another signal, and on the Roman left wing, additional cavalry units emerge from the woods. This has the effect of unleashing latent panic in McCallion's columns, and they rapidly lose all semblance of cohesion and begin to flee. In their alarm at the horse archers charging their rear, the Franks and Alemans rush forward through the gaps in the Roman line and upset their vanguard there. Thus, the entire Frank and Aleman army is now behind the original Roman positions, and the Herulians neatly march forward and take their place amidst the formation. The Romans, in their regular and practiced division, then advance in a line on the hysterical enemy, who is left with 2 choices: annihilation at the hands of the resurgent and merciless advance, or else to throw themselves into the river. To make matters worse, the Roman horse archers have retaken their places on the wings, and with the support of the ferocious infantry, they spray deadly hails of arrows down at the stranded units on the banks. The carnage is like nothing else. A few make it across the river, but the majority drown in the effort. Those that choose to offer resistance die where they make their stand. The chronicler Agatius records that fewer than 10 men survive from McCallion's force of 20,000, while the Roman deaths are significantly lower than 100 in total. It is a superlative and glorious victory for the empire. Though there is no way for him to be sure at the time, Narses has finally secured Italy for the empire, and in honor of his service, Emperor Justinian makes him exarch, or governor of the entire peninsula. A new dawn has risen for the Romans, and what was lost has now been refound. Narses embarks on a years-long project of rebuilding, reorganizing and replenishing, and for the first time in 100 years, those who believe in the divine destiny of the universal empire and faith can console themselves that all is as it should be. If you like what you see, consider supporting my work on Patreon, and you get ad-free early access to my videos for as little as $1. You can also show your support by liking the video, commenting and subscribing to my channel as a sacrifice to the algorithm. As always, I'll see you in the next one.